This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Has the time come to add this bird's morning call back into our dawn chorus? In this episode of Rewilding in Action, I'm on a mission to find out how Te Ao Māori and Mātauranga Māori contribute to the practice of rewilding in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I talked to two members of Te Runanga o Otago about how taking a Maori worldview and its knowledge is helping to guide ecological restoration on the Otago Peninsula, including the possibility of reintroducing Buff Weka there, a large, flightless, omnivorous rail that is extinct on the east coast of the South Island. This episode of Rewilding in Action is sponsored by the Otago Peninsula Trust. Check out their website, otagopeninsula.co.nz, to find out about their conservation initiatives and nature-friendly tourist attractions. Kia ora, welcome to Rewilding in Action with me, your host, Maureen Howard. I'm keen to explore how Te Ao Māori or Māori worldview and Mātauranga Māori or knowledge can help give a unique flavour to rewilding in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So in September, I spoke with my guests Tūmai Cassidy and Hoani Langsbury, who belong to the Otago Runaka on the Otago Peninsula and who are both passionate about native biodiversity and work in the field. I invite Hoani and then Tūmai to introduce themselves with their pepeha.
Kia ora koutou, ko Aureki Te Mauka, ko Waitaki Rawa, ko Taki Te Mudawaka, koutou ka te māmoi wai taharapa wai ka te hāwea nā iwi, o tākou te whenua, o tākou marae, ko Hoani Langsbury aho. Kia ora.
Kia ora. And Tūmai, I'd love to hear from you to introduce yourself.
Kia ora. Ko Pukekura Te Mauka, ko tākou te awa, ko tākou te marae, kai te ruhiki te hapu, kai tahu ka te māmoi waitaha, ka iwi. Kia ora.
Kia ora. So thank you, Hoani, for coming back again. And for the, I guess it's the last actually of our 4 Otago Peninsula Trust episodes that they've sponsored. And welcome to Tūmai. So you're very connected to the Otago Peninsula too, aren't you, through the Runaka? And I guess you spend quite a lot of time out there, even though you don't live there at the moment.
Yeah, most of the events that we have out at the marae, supporting our whānau with our different obligations, pōwhiri, funerals, tangihanga, but also our runanga meetings. Yeah, just trying to support and contribute as much as I can to our whānau.
Yeah, that's awesome. They're very lucky to have you. And to have you both. So in today's programme, what I was really wanting to get in, so I'm sort of alternating site visits, and we were in the last episode we were with you, Hoani, to talk about the Cook scurvy grass. And so what we wanted to do in this programme is to kind of alternate it and be looking at the thinking behind rewilding and what we think about this approach to, increasing in our biodiversity. And today I would really love to look at the principles, some of the principles behind rewilding. And one of them, in fact, is that, rewilding really embraces knowledge from different sources. So not only science, but also local knowledge, people who've lived on land for generations, and traditional environmental knowledge. So, and here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we're very, very fortunate that we have a very alive and growing, I would say, Maori worldview, Te Ao Māori, and Maori knowledge, Mātauranga Māori. And so I was really I've got this great privilege to talk to you both today about that and to see how it links in with rewilding. And, I invite you to share what you want to share, obviously. I'm really grateful for that. So thank you for coming on the show to talk about that. And so the first thing I just was really hoping to maybe is talk about in the last episode, Hoani, you spoke a little bit about a holistic worldview that you felt has come from your being Maori. And so I was really keen to kind of ask you a little bit more about that in terms of maybe the Otago Peninsula context and how you see that shaping how you see the future for the Otago Peninsula.
So that's been, for me, developing since about 99 when I returned home from the North Island, where I undertook some European study at Vic and came out with a BSc in zoology and ecology, to return home and work at the marae for 11 years and get re-embedded in the Te Ao Māori approach to things, which is holistic. So that means that we include humans within nature when we're looking to manage it. We're looking at the species that are significantly out of balance, and we're looking at the environment that contributes to that and thinking about what was there in the past and what we need to get back on the landscape to ensure that species can again become self-sustaining.
Okay. And so have you any specific examples of projects or things that are happening?
So we have a project coming up led by Te Runanga Otago, which is the Sustainable Otago Peninsula Initiative, which we're about to go public with. It's currently being signed off by the Runanga Otago Peninsula Trust and Otago Peninsula Biodiversity Group. And that is about coming up with a holistic model for the entire community to live and breathe a holistic way of looking after your environment, the terrestrial and the marine environment and the people that live there.
So if we were to compare it with, a more a Western approach, how do you see this Te Ao Māori approach really adds to the conversation?
And I think it's not necessarily the approach, it's the values that particular communities have. So we think about a healthy environment, healthy people, and you hear that type of terminology used by not just Indigenous peoples.
Yes, so I think we all have it, and I guess maybe what you're saying is it's not getting siloed down one particular avenue, isn't it? But it's always seeing all the threads at the same time.
I often see European science specifically managing a single species, and it's almost like they're doing it in isolation, where you can't manage Indigenous species without considering the environment that they're operating within and that wider biome that surrounds and supports them.
And that includes people as well, isn't it?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
People are part of nature.
We are, and actually that brings me then to another value that, as you say, is Mataranga or Te Ao Māori value, and also that we humans are part of nature. And so, how do you think that shapes how we approach nature and species conservation?
I'll just say something briefly and then pass over to Tūmai, because this is my second show and it'll be good to hear from the generation coming behind us. But humans are part of the problem, but we also have to be part of the solution.
Yeah, and I think it really is about getting, our entire community at place to understand where exactly we fit in to the environment and how the environment fits in with us. I think that's one of those things that throughout the country our communities haven't, particularly over the last 150 years, haven't seen themselves as a part of the natural ecosystems or environment that surround them. And I think we're so used to trying to control everything and keep nature over there and humans over here. And so I think it's about starting to unpack and relearn some old knowledge, but also use some of the new knowledge that we have from our modern current experiences to enrich our lives and enrich, I guess, the standard of living, the standard of jobs and all of those kinds of things that can live in balance with the environment, rather than trying to constantly shift it away from us and keep it as something just to look at. Well, we actually live in it. So it's about trying to return to something probably similar to what our ancestors did in terms of the values and how we interacted in our relationship with the land.
And when we think about being part of our environment, instead of it just being something that we kind of, as you say, being separate from and that we use for our own whatever uses, and not really seeing that actually we're dependent on it, aren't we?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key things from, I guess, our Maori and specifically our Ngaitahu perspective and values, is that we want to return to a situation where we get 90% of our sustenance from the ecosystems around us, rather than buying imported foods from other countries and those types of things. I think we look at these global issues that we're having, but not only global but local issues around food sovereignty, quality of food, all of those kinds of things. The environment can play a big role in actually solving some of those issues for us if we learn and listen.
And, because when we import things, we don't see the impacts of our behaviour, do we? So, but if it's really local, well, you can see if things are being degraded, if you're having an impact on the population or various things. So, but if it's always far away, then, we're all just doing things and we've no idea what it's impacting, do we? So another bit of a difference, I think, or that rewilding has, as well as seeing people as part of the environment, as Mātauranga and Te Ao Māori does, is having that focus on ecosystem functions as opposed to seeing species in isolation. So I was just wondering if either of you would like to comment on that.
I think it follows on from the discussion we had on the last show in relation to the tick and thinking about other species that have different roles in the environment that we haven't been able to observe for over a century. And the one I'm thinking of is the Buff Weka, which we've had a project reintroducing that within its range on the east coast of the South Island since settlement. So it's been running over 2 decades. And what the PF 2050 Limited Initiative has provided us is the opportunity to look at different landscapes where introduced species are being removed, and we can reintroduce our taonga species that actually are significant contributors to getting your wilding land back into balance. And we think the Buff Weka will be one of those.
Okay, so I'm just going to take us back a few sentences. You've introduced a lot, which is very exciting, but one of them will come on to the Weka, but is when you talk about the PF 50, it's predator-free 2050. And so for those people who are overseas, that's basically about this goal to, I guess it's to not all species of predators, but a certain number have been selected, the mustelids, the rats and the possums, to remove them from our from all of the mainland Aotearoa New Zealand, and so there's that goal to do that by 2050, which is a fantastic goal and an inspirational goal, something for us to work toward. And then the other thing was you talked about the southeastern part of New Zealand, the South Island, I should say, and that the Buff Weka has been reintroduced. Tell me what places that's in.
So there were a small number that were taken to the Chatham Islands about a century ago, and we had the opportunity to bring some of those original descendants back here, and we introduced them to the Wanaka Islands. Very quickly they grew in numbers, so we then transferred to several of the Wakatipu Islands, and we've had a small population on the mainland, but it hasn't been self-sustaining. But last year we started to see photographs and records showing that they were self-introducing up the Dart and the root burn, with a photo of one outside the root burn hut.
Oh, right, okay. So have people been living with them a lot? Well, I know on the West Coast people do live with Weka, but have they been coming into contact with people much?
There has been one living in the student quarter in Dunedin, so if that's what you're talking about, then okay, no.
Well, I should say... is it still living there? So it was in the newspaper that we had a Weka that someone had brought. They must have stuck it in the back of their car or something and brought it over.
We were pretty sure it was a Buff Weka, so potentially it came from Central Otago.
Really? Oh, that's interesting.
Or the Chathams, more likely Central Otago.
Okay, all right. Well, the mystery of the Buff Weka in Dunedin shall continue.
So if anyone's still seeing that Weka, we want to hear about it.
Right, okay. All right, you heard it here. Please report that. And so if we're thinking about its ecological function for this Buff Weka, obviously it was historically part of the East Coast here and had quite an important role in the ecosystem. So what role did you see that it had? So
the Weka are an apex omnivore. So they would have provided a significant amount of ecological services. But because we haven't seen them on the landscape for some time, we've actually asked Tūmai to go off and do some research. So I'm going to pass it over to Tūmai to answer that question.
Yes, so often we think about Weka. I think the interactions that we've had in our context, within the last sort of 30, 40 years within conservation is Weka predating things And often those observations are of weka on offshore islands where they didn't sort of naturally belong, and the species that they're predating haven't naturally evolved to cope with things like weka predation, those types of things. But actually when we look to weka populations on the mainland in their natural range, we actually see that they provide a number of really beneficial ecosystem services. One of them is the weka is one of the only species left that can distribute large seeds. So we often say kiriru are the only ones sort of left, and to a certain extent that's true. They're probably the most common one left. But weka are also one of the only birds that will have a large enough gape to swallow and distribute the seeds of miro, karaka, other types of large-seeded.
So those seeds would have come out intact?
Yeah. And they're quite opportunistic, and so they'll also predate and they'll scavenge on different animals, birds, lizards, those kinds of things. And when you pair that up with a large seed, you get a really fertile, nutrient-rich fertiliser that helps that seed to actually germinate. And one of the interesting things is some of the research that's come out shows that weka are actually, in some cases, more effective of spreading seeds further away from parent trees than kiriru. And so a lot of our native trees, their seedlings won't grow as well beneath a parent tree. And so the way that kiriru feed is they fill their guts up and then they have to go and release those seeds, and quite often they'll release them quite close to the parent tree. And so, yes, although they are one of the main seed dispersers, we also believe that weka have another key role in supporting them to spread those large tree species.
That's really true, because often when you see a bird before it flies off, it will defecate, I guess, to reduce the weight of its body before it heads off. Whereas weka, as a flightless species of bird, quite a big one, they'll be grazing around and then moving because they're not having to go off and fly. So yeah, that's a really, really good point. So, yeah.
And I think also because we haven't observed them in abundance and where they used to belong, we all have some learning to do, and I guess we'll have to mitigate some of those impacts, especially when there's, some of these really threatened, rare, endangered species that would have been able to cope naturally with that weka predation, but because of those introduced predators, until we can get those predators out of the ecosystem, then we'll have to have some mitigations in place. And then eventually, once everything's back in balance, we shouldn't really need to step in and try and save another species from another species, because they did evolve together and they will flourish together.
So I guess we can say this is further down the track for the Otago Peninsula. Is that?
So we're planning to introduce the weka following the removal of the likes of mustelids and other predatory species. So that way there'll be a net reduction in the amount of pressure on the species that are important to us, that are still there and are just hanging on. And we don't know that long term actually those species will benefit from the weka being in the environment. We know they're actually good at rabbiting, taking out rodents, and they'll go down into dens and take out young mustelids. So we see them as a biological control to follow up the human-based control we'll use for those introduced species removals.
Okay. What kind of changes do we need to be getting as humans to welcome this species into our life, to kind of learn to live with it? Because that is, in part, that is quite a lot of the adjustment. Each generation of people gets used to having nature behave in a certain way with them, and having a certain amount of abundance of nature and different species. And, I've heard people complain about birdsong, the dawn chorus, but what we have now is nothing compared to what apparently it was like in the past when there really was a proper dawn chorus. So Tūmai, because I know that I had gone to a talk that you had given, and this was one thing that you did address, that there will be a way in which people need to also get used to more wildlife in our lives.
Yeah, I think it really goes back to that conversation around our values and I guess how we view the species and the environment around us. I think when we think about what we'll have to do to be able to live with weka, it's not too different to what we'll have to do to live with pūkeko, or in some places of the country live with kiwi. And so probably one of the big issues would be around making sure your dogs aren't roaming off. And we don't want to encourage it anyway. And currently that isn't encouraged. And the other thing would probably be people's gardens. But it's when you go to the West Coast, most people have a garden. If you go to the East Coast of the North Island where they still have weka, people still have gardens and we still have weka. So it's not as if we're going to have to completely turn our whole lives upside down to be able to cope or live with these species. It's just about making those small changes and really how we value them rather than seeing them as something negative and appreciating the good things that they do for us and for the environment.
That's right, because I think, yes, if we go in with that attitude, then we will make the changes. I live in the city, so I actually don't need to protect my chickens from mustelids. There's none where I am, and so they can just roam in and out of their little hen house. But if I live further out in the country, then I would need to take precautions. So I guess it's just a matter of making practical changes to your life, isn't it, really? And in particular, we're welcoming this new species, and the weka is a very lovable species, isn't it?
Yeah, they sure are.
They're great characters, and I think that they would add a really, really positive thing to our lives. But so this is just one example that we're talking about, looking at a species in terms of a rewilding and also a Te Ao Māori perspective. So I feel very excited that there is a great commonality in the approaches, and also very privileged that here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that our rewilding story can have a very distinct flavour to it. I just was wondering, what are you both hopeful about when it comes to how you see rewilding adding to perhaps Mātauranga Māori or even to conservation where you are?
So we have a responsibility through whakapapa to look after those species that are related to us. And that's pretty much every Indigenous species that's out there. And we'll prioritise taonga species or species that taste good over time. But it's not like we're just going to turn on a tap and tomorrow the whole peninsula is going to change. It will be a slow transition to re-achieve that balance. And we think that's several hundred years actually of work. So though we might start at one end and work our way back towards the city, those changes will happen slowly over time and the community will be able to keep step with those changes. And probably the last thing is we observe lots of revegetation projects where everyone buys trees and they replant them. That's fantastic. But no one's out there buying the insects or buying the lizards and all those other sort of things that have that commensurate relationship with the forest that's being re-established. And it's those sort of things that we're thinking about.
Yes, it's that bringing us right back to where we started, that holistic view, and that every species is valuable and important in its own right. Okay. Well, thank you both very much for coming on the show today. And so I'll wish you all the best with your vision and bringing everyone along and through your lives and your children's lives and their children's lives. This is an intergenerational thing, so that we're on this journey. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Cool.
I'm very grateful to Hoani Langsbury and to Tūmai Cassidy for sharing some of the values and understanding of Māori, in particular Ngāi Tahu, and for sharing part of their intergenerational vision for the Otago Peninsula. So keep an eye out for the Sustainable Otago Peninsula Initiative community meetings that are being organised for November. And it's not surprising maybe that reintroductions came up in this interview. In the Northern Hemisphere, the rewilding approach is really well known for its successful reintroductions of keystone species such as wolves and beavers as a way to kickstart an ecosystem that has got out of balance because of their absence. And by keystone species, what I'm meaning is species where a relatively small number of individuals have a big and important impact on the ecosystem. Whether or not a reintroduction will work well may depend on factors like how long the species has been absent, as well as how much the ecosystem has changed. So if the proposal to reintroduce Buff Weka has grabbed your attention, I recommend you read this article that's on the Predator Free New Zealand website. It's about past and present ecological roles of Weka, and it's based on the findings of a 2021 literature review paper by Manaki Whenua Landcare. I'll put links to both on my Rewilding in Action Facebook page. I'm Maureen Howard, and you've been listening to Rewilding in Action. In the next episode, I'll be visiting the garden of my guest, Professor Jolanda van Heesik, who is an urban ecologist at Otago University. We'll be finding out what we can do to rewild our own suburban backyards and the role that our gardens can play as part of a larger ecological corridor. Until next time, I will leave you to appreciate the sounds of Buff Weka, courtesy of the Department of Conservation, to finish this episode with my guests, rewilders Hoani Langsbury and Tūmai Cassidy, who are letting nature take the lead.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.